Hey everybody, it's Jason Blah here, and one of the topics that comes up frequently when I mention the fact that one of the ways that people can separate size versus strength is the people who abuse anabolics, and that if people didn't have access to anabolics, and particularly if they didn't abuse them, we wouldn't actually really be having this conversation about size versus strength to the degree that we do. In other words, it would be down to a very small discrepancy based upon slight differences in neuromuscular efficiency from training, leverages, height, muscle insertions, things like that. But yeah, height is actually one of the biggest factors, but that's its own topic by itself. But the point we get to is that a lot of people will say, so are you saying that anyone who uses anabolics of any type is going to be weak? And no, that's not what we're saying at all. In fact, too many people out here, because they aren't really educated on the topic, even though use of these substances is extremely widespread. Millions and millions of people have admitted in first world countries over the years in surveys to having experience with them. It's far more common than a lot of people seem to realize. But in spite of that, there's a profound amount of ignorance about this topic, in the sense that people just assume natty versus enhance. Like, it doesn't even occur to them that there are degrees of enhancement. And because in a lot of people's minds, because they only see it as this magic threshold that people cross, this magic line, instead of a massive continuum, that they don't understand that there are literally people who use 100 times as much as someone else. And I don't mean figuratively, I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I do mean that. That on the two extremes of use of these things, it is the equivalent of knowing someone who drinks 1 shot per week of whiskey versus someone who takes 100 shots of whiskey per week. There is a profound difference between the two. And if you think of it in those terms, that's the level of continuum that you are dealing with. And most people are obviously somewhere between those two extremes who are enhanced. And that's another factor that really creates this disproportionate idea there. Because when you really start digging a little closer into the research, this first kind of came to light when a study was done a number of years back, and I've linked it before, where they took a bunch of strength athletes and a bunch of bodybuilders, and they took people who, in their surveys, were lifetime drug-free. Right, had at least something like 3 years. I could be getting it wrong. It was something like 3 years of very serious lifting experience, and they had a strength base built, and they compared them to a group of bodybuilders who all admitted to long-term anabolic use. And what they found when they started checking their maxes and their ability to produce force on different exercises, and I'm talking even locked into a machine sometimes, like leg extension strength, leg press strength, they found that they had a disproportionate amount of strength relative to their muscle mass, meaning the people who used substances, every pound of muscle that they had put on their body produced less total strength than the people who had done it 100% through training, with no substances put into their body to help. And that was fascinating, because that was one of our first glimpses of something measurable to look at and realize that under normal circumstances, particularly when we test something in isolation, right? When we take the multi-joint equation out, size equals strength completely. In other words, if we lock you into a curl machine where you can only bend the elbow and it locks your body into position, or we lock you into a machine to test force that you're producing with your quads in a true leg extension to where they don't let you move at all. So again, you can't move your body or your hips in any way or shift to the side. On a curl or a leg extension, we find that the cross-sectional area of that muscle is the primary factor in how much force you produce. And it's not even a minor discrepancy. It's very small differences from person to person. Again, you have to adjust for leg lengths and stuff, but literally the size of your quads will determine how much they can leg extend when no ability to move or brace or adjust anything is there. Same thing with a curl. When you're locked into a machine curl, that determines it, right? That determines your strength. Now, we don't do that in the real world, because even a strict curl contest, there's going to be some movement of the shoulder happening, right? So you eliminate that even in the strictest of environments when you're not strapped physically to a machine, with researchers not allowing your body to move and forcing only a single joint to move. That would never be done in any real world, even the strict curl contest. But when we lock it into a lab and they are there measuring it, yes, your size does equal your strength. Except when anabolics come into the mix. And that's the wild card. So it creates this idea. People would look at that data and say, aha, so anyone who uses gear is going to be weak for their size. But that's actually not true. That's not true. Because we find that when we take those studies and you give the people 300 or 600 milligrams or whatever of test and don't allow them to train, they still gain strength. And people need to keep that in mind. Those studies in which they had people stay sedentary who were previously lifters and do these studies and they gained all this muscle, their leg press and their bench press strength all increased. They increased. However, it wasn't proportionate to the muscle that they gained. And people need to remember that. Size always equals strength. So what they found even in these studies is that if a person's chest and triceps grow while being sedentary from using these things, if they quit lifting completely, their bench still goes up a little bit. And in fact, when studies have looked at this, and Greg Nuckols did a big write-up on this, he broke down all the data and analyzed it really closely because he was curious, and he found the break point looking at the research where this occurs. In other words, people who use very small amounts, even in the studies, they do gain a proportionate amount of strength because there are oftentimes some lifting still involved. What you find is that the people who use these things and gain very small amounts of muscle from using very small doses, the strength that they gain is proportionate to the size. Right? So it's not automatically that anyone who's using anything is going to be weak for their size. It's a dose-dependent response because what we find is that this occurs just normally with 300 milligrams or less. If we just take testosterone, because that's our baseline, most of the studies are done on that. We don't have a lot of studies looking at these other substances in isolation, and no one uses them that way. So when we look at testosterone, that's what Greg Nuckols determined on his research is that up to about 300 milligrams, which by most standards is a very conservative amount, that the research does show a proportionate strength gain relative to your size. However, as doses go up from there, the strength does not scale to the size gains anymore. And we want to be clear on that. So what we're saying is, let's say you take some bodybuilder who uses a gram of testosterone. They're going to get stronger from the muscle growth. Right? They're going to get stronger from the muscle growth. But the strength that they gain will not be equal to 20 pounds of muscle growth or the gain. They might put on 20 pounds of muscle, but it's not going to give the same strength increase that 20 pounds of muscle would have given them as a natural. And the first 20 pounds of muscle, let's say their strength went up. They trained naturally and gained 20 pounds of muscle completely clean. They're going to gain a certain amount of strength, and it's going to be proportionate. And then if they went over and used, say, a gram of that, and they gain 20 pounds of muscle, it will not be the same strength increase that they got from the 20 pounds they gained clean. It will be a smaller amount, a considerably smaller amount. But they will still gain strength, meaning if they got their bench press up to, 275 for 5, and then they use a bunch of gear, their 5 rep max is going to go up. Right? It is going to go up. However, this same person in that first 20 pounds of muscle very well might have gone from literally a 65-pound bench for 5 to a 275-pound bench for 5, right? Over 200 pounds onto their 5 rep max. When this person gains this from a gram of test, it's not going to be a 200-pound increase on their 5 rep max. They're not going to go to 475 for 5, right? It's not going to be like that. And that's what we're noting. And so it seems to be at around any crossing over about 300 milligrams, it starts to become disproportionate. And it seems to continue. In other words, someone who gains X amount of muscle on 1,000 versus 500 will gain less strength per pound of muscle on the 1,000 than they would have gained on the 500. And the people on the 500 will gain a little less strength per pound of muscle than the people who are using half that again. And so that's what we're talking about when we say that the more enhanced you are, the more disproportionate your size and your strength is. And it's not saying you're going to be weak, because let's be honest here. There is no person who lifts weights who has put 50 pounds or 60 pounds of lean tissue on their body, even through the use of illicit substances, who is going to be weak. Like, we don't mean weak. They might be benching 450 pounds. They might have a 5'10" squat. They might have a 600-pound deadlift. But when you weigh 260, that's not very good. Right? That's the point. It's particularly for their height, because they'll usually be a shorter guy if they're only at that height and they put that much lean tissue on. And we're not talking about a contest lean. We're talking about, more their off season. So therein lies the problem, and that's what we're talking about when we say that it's not proportionate. And so usually someone's size versus their strength level is an indicator not of always whether they're natural versus enhanced. It's an indicator of how much they use, right? It's an indicator of their level of abuse. That's what we're looking at. Because a person who is modestly enhanced, it won't appear at all, right? Someone who uses low amounts based upon the research will gain a exactly directly proportionate amount of strength relative to the size gains that they gain. It won't be noticeable. But as they use more and more and more, the gap grows larger. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.